Welcome. We're delighted to have you joining us for this Esquimalt Integrated Resource Management webinar. And I want to introduce myself. My name is James Pratt. I'm grateful to be living, working, and playing on unceded Lekwungen territory, the home of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. I'm a registered professional planner, serving as an independent consultant, specializing in strategy, organizational development, and stakeholder engagement. Father of three grown children, I've been based in Victoria since 1995, and I'm honored to serve as a facilitator for this webinar. And behind the scenes, we have Tara Zajac, who's providing Zoom support, and her role is serving as Manager of Communications for the Township of Esquimalt. Thank you, Tara. And we have Graham Bethel as one of the presenters here. Graham is a gasification specialist, president and co-founder of Pivotal IRM. He specializes in the integration of solid and liquid wastes and biomass to produce clean heat, cooling, and power, biochar markets, and district energy systems. Chris Corpse is the other presenter, and Chris is a land economist, as well as CEO and co-founder of Pivotal IRM. His experience has included feasibility and viability assessments for sustainable land development, economic development, and energy projects. He specializes in complex cases and has worked on some of the largest and most difficult projects in Europe and Canada. So for this 90-minute webinar, the design and our intention is to engage Esquimalt residents and all of you here in learning about and providing feedback on an integrated resource management gasification project for Esquimalt. So what we're going to do is we'll run the 10-minute video by way of presenting highlights of this study and what it recommends. After that, we'll answer some of the questions that we've received in advance, and then we'll answer some questions from you. So we'll ask you to use the chat function on Zoom, and you'll be able to pose questions that way. But the first part is just offering the video for anyone who hasn't seen it, or for those of you who have, please bear with us. 10 minutes as a refresher on that to all get on the same page.
Welcome to a short presentation that looks at using waste to reduce cost and greenhouse gases in Esquimalt using integrated resource management. IRM came from provincial guidelines for maximising the use of waste, which Esquimalt residents expressed support for during Capital Regional District's sewage treatment project. With Council's declaration of a climate emergency, a study was commissioned to see if IRM could help reduce both GHGs and costs. The study concluded this is feasible, so a range of online information, a webinar, and questionnaire are available so residents can provide feedback to Council. Heartland Landfill is facing challenges as it nears capacity. While it could be expanded, this has resulted in fires, emissions, and other problems in the past, and after landfills close, they still have to be managed to contain contaminants, which is expensive. Today, however, alternatives exist that can reverse these problems while costing less and simplifying household waste sorting. This generates local sustainable heating and cooling, while producing a sterile fertilizer that can sequester carbon, thus displacing fossil fuels. Moving towards this will require investment and effort to manage the project, and the plant will need to be located in Esquimalt to maximise GHG reduction and minimise costs. Let's review what this means. IRM is a process that looks at waste as a resource that needs to be optimised, not disposed of, to maximise both environmental and financial value. For Esquimalt, this mostly means tackling household and yard wastes from which heating and cooling can be captured to displace fossil fuels, and sterile fertilizer generated to sequester carbon. All of this and more generates revenues that pay for the system costs. For this reason, recycling of sewage heat, water and electricity have been deferred until they are more viable. Perhaps the first thing to realize about waste is that recycling isn't easy because of composites such as this shoe, which is difficult to separate into its constituent parts, raising cost, complexity, or even being environmentally impractical. This means it's much more difficult to recover resources than implied by this summary of Hartland's wastes, which makes it look easy. Technologies have to be chosen carefully, so let's look at why gasification was selected. A common and popular solution is composting or anaerobic digestion. However, these only work with organics, which are roughly 11% of the waste stream. The systems needed to collect and process this waste are not as efficient as other options and can be expensive, with few revenues to offset the costs. Another alternative is generating biofuels. However, technologies are still developing, and there's currently no single system able to manage all Esquimalt's wastes, so multiple plants would be needed. Locating such a plant in Esquimalt would also be difficult. The most common option globally, however, is thermal conversion, which copes with the widest range of wastes. Europe and Asia have been developing technologies and expanding their use since the 1970s, largely for reasons of efficiency, flexibility and viability. This does not mean that recycling, composting or other approaches have to end, but rather that advanced gasification acts as a catch-all, so recycling can continue or expand if it makes sense. This means that gasification can address aspects such as plastic bags or styrofoam until other recycling options take its place. This is why not only Europe and Asia, but Nova Scotia, for example, has embraced thermal systems as an integral part of optimized recycling. It helps to know that Esquimalt's not alone in pursuing this. In Europe, to reduce GHGs, the EU has set a target of 90% diversion by 2035, and some countries are already achieving 100%. To put it in context, Esquimalt's current recycling is probably achieving about 43% landfill diversion, but by moving to an IRM approach, could achieve over 90% diversion. A Polish study showed the number of gasifiers in the EU had almost tripled in 20 years, and while not all of these are processing municipal waste, gasifiers that do have over 1,000 years combined operating experience. For those wanting to know more about Europe's experience, Pivotal's website has an interview with a manager in Gothenburg explaining how they went about a move towards what we now call IRM. The technology identified for Esquimalt is therefore advanced gasification. Gasifiers are sealed units that heat waste to a temperature where it converts into its component gases, so almost everything is usable and emissions are similar to natural gas boilers. It's important to note that this is different to incineration, because the systems exclude oxygen, so the waste can't burn, which helps avoid pollution. Advanced gasifiers are also small, making them easy to locate in Esquimalt. One important aspect is that sorting and recycling should be simpler. Instead of separating waste as they are today and dropping garden waste off at the public works yard, only blue bin recycling will still need to be separated. Despite this, resource recovery will actually increase, for example by producing a sterile fertilizer known as biochar. Very simply put, biochar contains carbon extracted from the atmosphere and when used as a soil supplement, reverses the actions of fossil fuels. This creates a tangible reduction in GHGs, but at no additional cost to the taxpayer. The recommended approach is projected to reduce greenhouse gases by about 4,500 tonnes annually, which would exceed the township's 2030 corporate target and achieve almost a third of the entire community's targets. This is roughly equal to taking about 970 internal combustion engine cars off the road each year, and is one of the few ways that a significant portion of GHG reduction targets can be achieved easily and quickly. For recycling to be optimized, the plant needs to be centrally located. The best option is the public works yard because the township already owns it and any impact would be low. This is because the gasifier is virtually silent and would need on average 3 trucks a day, which are already circulating collecting waste, so traffic impacts will be small. The main advantage to the public works yard, however, is that it's only a short distance from the town centre, which makes it cost-effective for supplying the recovered energy to consumers. As the main driver for this project is environmental, that's where this summary starts. Firstly, cradle-to-cradle efforts currently met by composting will receive almost the exact same tonnage, but using a sterile biochar. This should not only help address compost contaminations identified by CRD, but also improve carbon sequestration. IRM should be able to exceed the township's corporate 2030 GHG reduction targets and be about 1/3 of community targets, while raising landfill diversion from about 43% to 91%, which is in line with European experience. While the system is estimated to cost $21 million, there is the potential to generate a taxpayer dividend of up to $360 per home. Achieving this will require diligence, but this is little different than other options. Simple steps can be taken to address the main risks early on, should Council decide to proceed. It may help to see some examples of gasifiers. This first picture is of Dockside Green's energy plant, which shows that the systems can be designed to fit in with surrounding buildings. This picture shows a plant in Louisiana processing more than twice Esquimalt's waste volume to produce biochar, and here is the same plant viewed from the air. The Esquimalt plant will be much smaller at just under half an acre, which is small compared to the area needed for a landfill or other options. This is the world's largest pellet plant located in Georgia and producing biofuel pellets shipped to the UK to help meet its GHG reduction targets. To give an idea of scale, note the highlighted person standing at the bottom left compared to the size of the gasifier. This picture shows the unit in California that will test Esquimalt's wastes to confirm designs and qualify for a manufacturer's guarantee. An initial test has already confirmed that Esquimalt's wastes are compatible. Because Esquimalt is growing, there will be several small units like this, so the plant can be expanded as and when required. This defers investing in a plant capacity that could take time to occur, which lowers both risk and cost. We hope this short video has been useful, and more information is available online at www.esquimalt.ca/IRM. Council hopes you'll be able to participate and provide feedback. Thank you.
Excellent. As noted, I will serve as your facilitator for this session, and we're aiming to complete by 6:30 to honor your time. And we want to thank everyone, each and every one of you, for taking the time out of your busy lives to participate in this. And I want to note that questions that we don't have time to answer may be addressed offline through the project FAQ document that's already posted on the Township's website. And of course, this webinar is being recorded, so others will be able to view it at their convenience. Before we get into looking at some of the questions we've already received, here's a bit of additional information. Chris, could you add some of the updates since the video was made? Or Graham?
Graham, did you want to talk about there has been a grant that has come out late last week. We're trying to find out more information about it. The models that we ran about 1,100 cash flows, interestingly, to assess the sensitivity of the development. The grant is a provincial grant for organics processing, which this would likely qualify for. We're trying to find out more information about that, but it looks as though that would be compatible. We've since also had an indication from Hauler that they are interested in signing an LOI and then moving contractually into providing the waste over and above that which the community already controls. And so that would mean that there is the ability to go straight to handling the all of the township's waste at the one facility rather than phasing it, as had been assumed in some of the components. In terms of other factors, there's, Graham, is there anything else that particularly occurs to you?
Nothing until we start getting some questions, unless you've got direct questions.
Well, let's start with some of the pre-questions here. And the first one that we're going to address is, a number of people want to know why this doesn't include sewage sludge. Can you comment on that, Chris?
Yes, this is where gasification first arose in Capital Regional District. I think, to cut a long story short, CRD has decided what they're going to do with the sewage sludge and biosolids from the sewage treatment plant. That's now going to Esquimalt, to Heartland landfill. And so that's not really available anymore for current purposes. So that has been omitted. It may be that CRD wishes to subsequently discuss it, but they're going down the route, we understand, of pursuing other directions.
Thank you. And the second question related is, why hasn't CRD done this, and why aren't they doing it? Graham, if you could address that one.
Yes, as Chris said, this is where gasification first arose as a discussion topic. The CRD created an IRM task force that studied the topic and recommended that IRM should be pursued. However, the chairman of the Sewage Waste Management Committee announced shortly thereafter, and we're going back to probably 2018, that the CRD would not pursue IRM and that they would treat biosolids as a single stream, and they've continued along that path, which is a bit of a shame.
Thanks, Graham. Why do we need to do this in Esquimalt? The third question for Chris.
Yes. So the best way to explain that is probably to show a map or go and look at a map. But if you go and look at a map of Heartland landfill, there's almost no consumers of the energy that these systems produce nearby. And so the problem really with continuing to send it to Heartland is that the major, a significant portion of the resource recovery can't be used. Now, by contrast, if you locate that in Esquimalt, purely dealing with Esquimalt's wastes, it's maybe at most a 1 kilometer energy loop to distribute the energy, which is actually qualifies as sustainable energy, to consumers in the center of town, or alternatively, and this would need to be a subsequent discussion, to the Department of National Defense. There's an excess of consumers for the energy it can produce, but that's the reason really that you would not take it to Heartland. You also reduce the GHGs and costs of trucking, because the existing trucks are already circulating in the community, so you'd reduce those trucking costs and time and other components. So that's why.
Thanks. And a fourth question is, several people question the cost, and why do Esquimalt taxpayers have to pay for this? Chris, if you could address that one as well, please.
Yeah. The cost is the cost. I mean, but everybody focuses on the cost and they forget the revenues. The point about resource recovery is that it's drawing out a number of revenues. So those revenues are, first of all, the tipping fees, which are already being paid. But the second one is the heating and also cooling that can come from the plant. And then there's additionally, as was explained in the video, something called biochar, which is a fairly high value equivalent to compost, and so it's sterile as opposed to compost. This addresses a number of other increasing challenges. So it's not purely the cost that's the impact; it's also the revenue stream that becomes really the benefit of this. Why do Esquimalt taxpayers have to pay for this? Well, that's a choice that's really down to council. It would be possible for that to be done differently through what's called a concession. That's probably the best way of doing it. It's similarly to a concession for say a stand in a park selling ice cream. So they take it on for a period of time, and at the end of it, The township still has the park and it still owns the rights and so on. So it would be similar to that over a longer period. And that would be in return for a private sector partner bringing funding to the table and taking on some of the risks. So on the face of it, it's around $21 million, but it could be considerably less than that if you deduct grants, which it hasn't been assumed, but also the fact that it could be run differently as a concession. So in theory, it would be possible for it to be zero cost to the taxpayer, but then you would lose some of the benefits. The benefit in this instance, because of the revenues, is potentially as much as $360 a door based on current number of homes in Esquimalt. So there are some real reasons to look carefully at does Esquimalt take this on, or does it take it on with partners, or does it completely allow a facilitated process for somebody else to do it and no cost to the taxpayer. That's got to be decided by council.
Thank you. Of course, a number of people are asking about the traffic, noise, and smell. Do you want to talk about that, Graham?
Yeah. As Chris had, as the video states, the amount of waste or garbage that we're going to require is not going to change the number of vehicles that are currently operating in the community. So we don't see an increase in traffic. However, they will be directed towards the base and Canteen Road, where the facility is to be located. With regard to noise and odors, the processing facility will be what's called a negative pressure building. Therefore, there'll be no odors released from the building unless they go through an air emissions odor control system. And with those activities inside a building, you're simply not going to hear the noise above surrounding industrial operations.
Thank you. And two people have asked where this has been done in North America. Graham, I'll put that one to you as well.
Well, the question about waste management in North America is we found a very cheap and easy and out of the way model for doing it. It's called landfilling. Most landfills are a few miles just out of town, out of sight, and we've used those very efficiently for over 100 years or more. The question is probably because land costs are starting to change, pressure is growing, there is political drive now to move away from landfills. So the question is more about risk management, and Chris is probably better able to handle that one.
Thank you for dropping me in it. Yeah, it really goes back to the last question. The question is, do Esquimalt taxpayers handle this, or is it done in conjunction with the private sector? The issue really for are there example plants is really trying to get at, well, has it been done somewhere else, and have I seen it? There are examples that are similar to this, but you probably find that there are no exact circumstances identical to Esquimalt's anywhere. And so the issue, if you flip the issue around, the better concern is, can it be guaranteed? And so if you look at how CRD managed the sewage treatment project, and governments generally manage this kind of project, what they do is they say, well, you're the manufacturer, you're the provider of it, we want you to guarantee that it works. And so what we developed with the manufacturer was what we've called a test protocol, and that's sequentially running the actual samples of the waste through, and that they then guarantee that the plant will work. The first of those tests has happened. It's a demonstration test only, very brief, but it did confirm that the samples worked, and that gave the manufacturer the confidence sufficiently to say yes, based on that, or actually wide variants of it, they would be happy to guarantee it. And so the next steps would be laboratory tests and physical tests so that they can confirm on the design, and then they would guarantee it. Now, how that would work and so this replaces using purely examples, which won't be direct comparisons. What you would do instead is they would pay for and finance putting the plant in themselves, and then only when it achieves the yield that's in the business case, that's not completion of the plant, but that is actually operating and achieving the yield in the business case, only then would they get paid. So they've agreed to that in principle, and that's probably a more directed way of addressing the underlying risk. In other words, yes, it's been shown to work. Yes, they'll guarantee it. No, they don't get paid until it's confirmed.
Thank you. So that concludes the questions that were highlights of the ones we received in advance. There may be others addressed in the Q&A sheet, but we will ask you all to add your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll start to address the ones we've received already. So there was a first question that is, why will IRM not include blue box plastics and paper for this project?
Probably I can start to take that. This has been a question elsewhere, and the answer is that it could. And so in Atlantic Canada, they have different circumstances, and their problem is that it's not effective. It's not environmentally effective, and it's not financially effective to take many of the components in their blue box program. And that's one of the reasons why their minister adopted thermal treatment as a way of recycling, because they're recycling it into energy, and it's how it's been dealt with in Europe as well. So it doesn't rule out that the blue box components could come to the gasifier, but we haven't assumed that, at least initially.
Thank you. Next, we have the question, you referred to biochar production. So is this advanced gasification process pyrolysis? What temperature range would it operate at?
Let me pick up that question if you don't mind.
Thanks, Graham.
I'll just quickly say gasification and pyrolysis, similar, but not the same thing. And pyrolysis typically operates at a slightly lower temperature than gasification, but it does overlap on the lower end. In gasification, you have to have an agent that triggers a series of chemical reactions, the gasification process chemistry. And we're going to be operating in the range of 600 degrees Celsius, which allows for the volatiles to be drawn off and converted to synthesis gas, and it allows leaving a crystalline carbon biochar as the residue.
Thank you.
So around 550, 600 degrees Celsius. I see there's another question there on contaminants.
Yes. What substances are expected to be included in the air emissions, and how will they be measured? Is there real-time air monitoring to ensure safety of local residents?
Well, again, let me just comment on that. They've identified NOx, oxides of nitrogen, the oxides of sulfur, ozone, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter. There will be monitoring. I was fortunate enough to be the operator of the Dockside Green gasifier, and when we started up, we conducted emissions testing to establish a baseline, and thereafter we regularly reported back to the ministry. We're typically going to see maybe not so much NOx, but could be, but there'll be some chlorides. We find that the plastics and some of the vegetables and biomass matter does contain chlorine. So we will find some acids coming across. And of course, they also contain sulfur in the biomass. We will have inline scrubbers and filters, as well as catalytic oxidizers to remove these pollutants. Whether there'll be continuous monitoring at the end of the pipe, that's going to be a regulatory decision. Personally, I'm not sure it'll be required, but we can certainly include that in the process.
Thank you. A related question here is from Ted. Please confirm that there are no gas emissions from the gasification plant. And particulate matter you just spoke to, or other common pollutants.
Yes, that was the question I was looking at from Ted Week. And as I say, these products are likely to occur. The CO, see what happens is those things will go into a thermal oxidizer, which will then consume them. So the volatiles and CO, they will be consumed into energy. The sulfur compounds, nitrogen compounds, particulates, as I say, those will pass through scrubbers and catalytic converters to remove them from the gas stream before they're released to the atmosphere.
Thank you. Another one is, can you describe how the energy loop would function in Esquimalt?
Do you want to take that, Graham?
Pardon?
Well, I'll start and give an overall description, but Graham put the one in next to Dockside Green, so he should probably comment as well. Essentially, how it would work will depend on the next stage of assessment, because we need to confirm although we have an overall assessment of the energy demand in the center, there needs to be a more detailed assessment of precisely who consumes that and how. Essentially, what will happen is there will be pipes put into the ground. The distance is about 1 kilometer to City Hall. And so there'll then be a distribution loop and then a return loop, which will follow the same track. So they'll all be laid at the same time. Typically what happens with district energy loops, and this is no different than others, there are a number in BC. Probably the largest is in Southeast False Creek, but there's also ones at UBC, SFU, North Vancouver in particular has a very extensive one. And typically there's an out and return flow to them. What has to be determined is the best way to distribute this, because ideally for the revenues to be optimized, the gasifier will be 24/7. And so really what we need is for the consumers to also be 24/7. So we'll be seeking and negotiating to make sure that those are optimized, because if they're optimized, the revenues are optimized, and there's an increased dividend to taxpayers.
We'll go to a couple of the questions that had come in through the Q&A function. And the related one there is addressing the heating loop as well. And it is, can you explain in more detail how the revenues are generated? And what, or rather, would all the energy from the plant be utilized in Esquimalt Center? And are there costs associated with establishing a heating loop? And have these been accounted for?
So first of all, the costs, and then probably some of the other components Graham can talk to. Yes, the costs were included as an estimate within the model, with a fairly generous contingency until we know precisely where it's going to go and the implications of that. So yes, within the $21 million was a cost for the energy loop. That cost may rise depending on who the end consumer is and whether or not there's got to be some plant adaptation locally for that. So that number may change a little. In terms of the systems themselves, Graham, did you want to comment a little further about the loop?
Yes, let me just describe what happens here. We have an insulated pipe that flows out from the gasifier, circulates up to the town center and back, and water circulates in that pipe. So at every lot going up the street and into the loop, we can provide a connection. However, what we have not included in the project at this point, because there will be some on-site requirements to make use of this heat. And so there will be cost to the the lot owners. And at this point, we haven't really discussed how that's going to be addressed.
Just a last comment on this with respect to the revenues. Just because of the we're at a premature stage to use what I would call final numbers on this. On the revenue side, to give you an idea, the revenues that we assumed from this, an agreement was reached after we published the technical report, which was 50% higher in value than was assumed in the technical report. So to that extent, it's somewhat conservative. This is also linked to GHG reduction. One of the components of this, because we're using the synthesis gas from the gasifier to produce the heating and cooling, we're essentially offsetting the use of natural gas, which is typically fracked natural gas. And so what government has asked for is that there be an increased use of what's called either renewable natural gas. Now, the gasifier's product is increasingly being looked at as something which is equivalent to renewable natural gas because it displaces fossil natural gas. And so the fact that we're generating heating is actually treated in the same way as natural gases, but at a higher value. But as I said, the agreements were reached just slightly after we published our report at 50% higher than the values we've used in the report. We did also reach out to Fortis to understand how this might work, and we spoke to a major infrastructure group who've also signed agreements with them. And so we have some confidence that this should be feasible to do. Should council proceed, it would be an early item of risk that would need to be addressed.
One more question from the Q&A set, and we'll remind people who are just joining to please do use the chat box for your additional questions. This question is asking, what are the risks associated with generating new benefit to the township of $250 million over 30 years? Which one of you would like to take that on?
Can you just repeat the question? Because
it's a little bit confusing. What are the risks associated with generating new benefit to the township of $250 million over 30 years?
Okay, well, I'll take it first and then Graham can chip in if desirable. The risks are not to be understated. There are risks with all of these kinds of projects. The big difference, though, with a project of this kind is that, I come from essentially a real estate side, and nirvana for a developer is pre-leasing or pre-sales. So if you build a condo building, you try and pre-sell all of your units, and then your value is known. You have a fixed price on the contract, and you know how much profit you've made. So this is really no different. The concept here is that you would go into negotiation for the main revenue streams, as well as putting fixed price contracts together so that the revenues are agreed for an extended period. So typically these can be, for example, on the energy contracts. The discussions that we've had is it's feasible to put in place a 20 or 30-year contract. So then the revenues are known. They're backed by multinationals, and ultimately can be backed by links to statute. And so you're really managing a lot of those risks by pre-contracting them, and that's why the due diligence phase is really important, and the next steps are important to reduce those risks and pin down both the costs and the revenues. Graham, did you want to talk any further about that?
Yeah, no, I was listening to what you were saying.
I overwhelmed you, I can tell.
Well, I mean, risks, there are risks for feedstock. Are we going to get the same feedstock over the duration of the project? Because the feedstock will change. And that's going to be one of the biggest risks. Even if we get the volume, have we still got the same energy content in that material? so that we can extract it. And then, as Chris said, the output contracts, those are incredibly important too. Those are the two big risks, at the front end and the back end.
On the feedstock itself, it might help to augment that. One of the reasons we developed the test protocol with some engineers advising and working with University of California is so that the tests can show not only that the current feedstock works, but also that variants of it can also work. And so we did quite a lot of analysis with what the variabilities are, going back to 2011, assessing what Esquimalt's got. And it does vary actually very substantially. And that was a late piece of information in the study, that actually the organic waste stream does vary quite considerably. But after discussion, we identified that no, that's still within the parameters that this should operate. And so we have tried to start to address those risks, and more will need to be done during the next phases.
Simple question. Where is the recommended location for this?
We're looking at the intersection of Canteen Road and Esquimalt Road, and it's a part of the public works yard. I know we have that as a diagram, and it certainly was shown in the video and in all of the prepared materials that we have. It's going to be quite a tight location to fit it in, but we believe it can be done.
And will View Royal garden waste and organics be included in this project?
That's really going to be the position of Esquimalt, because if they're currently collecting that material, there's no reason why not. But I mean, that's just it. Right now, the project that's been done, the IRM study has focused on waste in Esquimalt. But there are opportunities from the region to pick up more waste. There's even an opportunity, should it come to this, that we could take the dried biosolids from the anaerobic digester at Heartland and process those as well. So there are lots of sources available, and there are ways to optimize this plant right from day one.
Thank you. There's a question, I'm not sure what process it's referring to. It says, what is the agent used in that process? And are there special safety protocols in place for storing, using, transporting it?
This, I presume that relates to the gasification agent that I raised.
Yeah.
It's common water, but it'll be high temperature water that is injected into the gasification chamber.
Thank you. And then a related question is, how do you heat up to 600 degrees? What do you use to accomplish this?
We use the syngas that comes out of the process. That will be combusted at a temperature approaching 2000 degrees, probably below 2000, but it's going to be in that 1600 to 1800 degrees Celsius range. That, Fahrenheit range. That will be the energy that is used to energize the gasification chamber. And excess is then pumped around the community for the district heating system.
Right, thank you. Would this initiative be complementary with an anaerobic digestion biogas facility for organic or wet wastes? If yes, has this been considered or assessed for feasibility?
Not in Esquimalt, it hasn't. No, not to our knowledge.
Okay.
There is a variant on this. Under provincial regulations, we need to consider, Ministry of the Environment requires the township to have considered what's called best available technology. And so some basic assessment by us was done, but really using the resources previously put together by Capital Regional District. Anaerobic digesters don't have as high a yield, and they can really only handle about 11% of the waste stream. That's by dry volume. And so if you view the video, you'll see that the percentages that really could use. Anaerobic digesters are also, comparatively speaking, that they have a lower yield, but they're also on a cost per unit of revenue, they're relatively less efficient. And so anaerobic digestion was considered, but only to a basic level because it doesn't meet the most of the thresholds for the particular type of feedstock that's being proposed.
Thanks, Chris. What sort of modeling has been undertaken to understand impacts on downstream communities?
We have not done any airshed modeling at this point. This is the preliminary feasibility study to develop the concept. As we've said, the next stage is more detailed studies where we will test the feedstock and we will model the potential contaminants coming from that and be able to address that question later at that time.
Thanks. Is it safe to say that were Esquimalt to go ahead with this technology, that we would be leading the way in the region in efforts to reduce carbon emissions and move toward a greener future?
Short answer, absolutely. Absolutely. We've looked at all of the technologies that are in use around waste management. And as Chris has indicated, they typically evolve around composting or anaerobic digestion or digestion of some sort. And gasification is at least twice as efficient as those processes. In compost, you don't get any energy back out of it. But we get the biochar, which is going to be in about the same quantity as that can be composted typically Esquimalt would compost anyways. And the biochar is an equivalent material, if not better, than compost as a soil amendment and soil conditioning agent.
Thanks, Graham.
I see there is a question there from one participant. How does the biochar that Graham mentioned turn into sequestration? It's probably, I'm the economist, so I can be simple. Basically, if you think about how the world works, the sun shines down on the ground grows food. Sometimes cows eat the food, we eat the cows. And so there's a byproduct, and that's waste. But other times it grows carrots, we eat the carrots, and then there's offcuts, food scraps, and so on. But if you trace it back, that means that a very high proportion of it is actually atmospheric, what's called atmospheric carbon, because it came from non-fossil sources, and it works out at about 88% of that waste stream is atmospheric carbon. So when you use the biochar, if you use it as a soil supplement, and almost everything ends up as a soil supplement or being buried or whatever, you're essentially taking carbon that came from the atmosphere, went into the plants, went into the cows, went into us, then went into the garbage, then went into the gasifier, then goes into the biochar, and then you bury it. And so it turns out that essentially what you're doing is winding back the impacts of fossil carbon in the atmosphere. So that's how this turns into carbon sequestration. I'm being excessively simplistic, but I'm only an economist, so that's the only way I can explain it. Hope that
Thank you,
helps.
Chris. Next question is, will this bring any new jobs to the area?
Yes. Yeah, and Graham can chip into this because of the examples in Europe, but in terms of direct jobs, the discussion that we had with the manufacturers that this can be manufactured at near Sydney Airport. We've met with the fabricators. They have provided competitive bids on a gasifier. They lost out by unbelievably only $50,000 on a prior bid. They understand the systems and technologies, and they're qualified to fabricate it. So there would be local fabrication jobs for this. There would also be local employment operating in the plant for those staff that within the township, if the township runs it, that were suitable and willing to and interested, then they would be able to transfer. There would be training before it started operations. Probably down in California, but it may be at some of the other plants, so that there's a working knowledge. And then additional training. The existing jobs on haulage and so on wouldn't change, so that's no different to now. Those would not be new jobs. In terms of total number of new jobs, actually quite low. This, in comparative terms, this is quite a small plant. So you're really only talking about 6 to 10 jobs probably. There would be some shift work and so on associated to it.
Yeah.
But the other part of this, now I can put the economist hat on, is you get a respending effect. So if you think about this waste going out to Heartland landfill, the waste is being buried, and so it's not a respending effect. It's all cost, and that cost leaves the community and goes to Heartland. Or some wastes are actually taken out of region altogether, and those go elsewhere. They may go to the Lower Mainland, they may go out to the Cowichan Valley, some may even go to Washington State. Now, the difference here is that you get a respending effect because you're bringing in revenues from the tipping fees. They're being paid by the local community. They're staying in the local community. That then gets paid to jobs in the local community. And so those people go out and they have a coffee or a restaurant or they go to the pub. So there's a respending effect.
Okay.
Now, that means this is an economic generator. And that's been the experience in Europe.
Thank you. Next is, how does the size of this development compare with the Dockside Green project?
Yeah, let me take on that question. It's going to be about twice as large, twice the size. Dockside Green was processing around 10 to 12 tons a day, and we're going to be processing around 25 at capacity, 25 tons a day.
That's actually a related question. We'll just go to this one. What percentage of maximum capacity will we start at? And is the income based on this percentage?
Well, first off, it's undecided at this point. We have assumed the current base of about 6,500 tons a year, growing to about 9,000 tons a year. However, as we've discussed previously from some of the questions, there's 9,000 tons of biomass available. That is a question that still has to be decided by staff and by council, but they have approved everything in the project so far. So it is our recommendation that we start at maximum capacity because that optimizes the cash values that we can get back.
Thank you. Going back to a question from John, have technical staff in Esquimalt reviewed your technical report, and are they in support of this project?
Yes, they have reviewed the document. We've had some feedback from them. They approved the project and took it forward to council, and we presented to council and got a unanimous approval to proceed further. So based on that scenario, yes, yes, and yes.
And is there opportunity for additional feedstock from DND next door?
I can take that one. Complex. DND's current relationship with the Township of Esquimalt is probably best explained by them, but I'll try and summarize it based on prior knowledge. The DND works in a very close working relationship with the township, and so a lot of the wastes, which are general wastes, are probably handled by private contract already, and they may not be handled necessarily by the township. Some of the other wastes, though, could actually be quite interesting to handle because when the Navy goes away on a deployment, when they come back, they may be carrying some of the wastes with them, and it would be possible for those to be redeployed into this facility. So at the moment, that discussion has not been held. There has been, we have reached out to the Navy, and I think probably the next steps would be for the township to engage with them and decide between the two of them where it makes sense for this to happen.
Thank you. There's a question from Terry that I think has been answered about the main purchaser of the heat energy being the municipality. Another question from Terry here is, how does the biochar compare with the product from the proposed CRD plant at Heartland, which appears to be opposed as a useful product?
Yes. The anaerobic digestion is a biological process, and it converts about half of the energy in the sewage, sludge, and there's a residual that comes after that. That is then dried, and that's the product that Heartland has. Unfortunately, through the biological process, it does not destroy the toxic chemicals that are found in human waste. And there are numbers that range up to 100,000 synthetic chemicals end up in our waste streams. So that material is in commas, although it is an approved, governments approve its application on land, it's actually a toxic material. And when you put that same material through a gasifier, it destroys all of those pharmaceutical products and all of those organic chemicals that sit in those materials. And that's the difference between taking that material as a material or composted material that would go on land versus biochar.
Related question here from Ted. You keep talking about biochar as a sterile fertilizer. If this is distributed to local gardens, my understanding is that the carbon would hopefully reemerge as plant matter. Is there a large market for the biochar, and is there a chance we could saturate the market?
Well, let me answer that question to start with, and Chris might be able to add to it.
Okay.
The number one, the plants are not going to be able to readily break down the crystalline carbon that is in the biochar. It typically takes 400 years for that to break down. So yes, plants grow, they have to have carbon to grow, but they're going to get that from the raw, composted materials that naturally end up in the soils, typically not from the biochar itself.
I can talk to the market for this. So you don't have to take my word for it. Here's the thing to do is open up your web browser, hopefully after the webinar, and go to Amazon.com. It's better than .ca just because more people contribute to it, and enter the word biochar and see how many hits you get, and then take a look at some of the products. The truth is that biochar isn't merely done as a soil supplement, but it sometimes is used as a filtration medium. And so even if it was, and these achieve higher values. So we did a study on this in December and found the values for that can be as much as $48,000 a ton. We have not assumed anywhere close to that. The plant in California is selling its biochar untested to a local community at $750 US a ton. But what you'll find is that the number of different types of product for biochar or active carbon and so on are enormous. In terms of the possibility that we'd saturate the market last year I think was under 150,000 tons a year in North America. This will have 1,200. No possibility this will saturate.
Next question from Susan. Is it possible that the feds in the province use Esquimalt as a test case and fund it accordingly?
Yeah, I can maybe talk to that one. Short answer, yes. Longer answer, you might not want to. Typically, the Fed, and I've been a provincial official in a long distant past, typically because federal and provincial programs have criteria for the funding programs that they wish to hit for the agendas that they have, they'll put criteria and timelines on them that increase the costs. We haven't assumed them, therefore, because it could stop this happening. Obviously, with the declaration of a climate emergency, Esquimalt has a timeline that it's got to hit GHG reductions. And so the problem is that if you wait forever for funding and grants and processes and approvals and tenders and failures, you could take a long time. This one has the ability to go ahead, subject obviously to council agreeing with that and various other bits. But it's not going to get bogged down by that if council chooses not to. Now, if by contrast federal and provincial government want to proceed, then yes, it's feasible to do so.
Coming back to some of the questions that had come in through the Q&A box here. If there is zero waste and potential benefits of $250 million, why are no other municipalities in the CRD interested in this technology?
In short, you'd have to ask them. I think Esquimalt is merely the first to look at this. There is another one just behind that. Being respectful, I would have to keep their name quiet. But this is not only not unique to CRD, but it's international, as the slideshow, the video shows. I think a number were waiting to see what CRD did, and then CRD decided not to follow it. So I wouldn't say that Esquimalt will be anything other than probably the first, but of several.
And question of how much will taxes be raised to implement this system?
Net, it should be nil. In fact, it should. I think the probability is that rather than it being a dividend, what it will do is it'll be used to reduce taxes from taxpayers generally. So it'll go to achieve public objectives without the need for taxpayer input. So overall, it will have a reduction in taxes. That's what we expect if it's implemented properly. The caveat there is that this is not merely a waste initiative, and it's the kind of initiative that governments generally are not really that good at, which is because it's got to think not only of the cost side but of the revenue side, and it has to work diligently on an efficient process. And that's why it may be that council decides to go the concession route or some hybrid to bring in the innovation of the private sector, but under the township's control to maximize their risk and revenues.
And a question of how much for Esquimalt and what are the financing options?
Well, it's down to what the township decides to do. It could take 100% position if it gets no grants and proceed, and then the current projection is 21 million of cost. That would be financed. Township has, because the province has actually a very good program for supporting financing for communities, that would be financed over a very long period of time. And so by the time the plant comes online and the revenues come online, the projections are that the revenues would exceed the debt service. So again, the implication is not 100% clear because there's some timing issues with that. And also the township's got to decide and confirm the scope. How big is this plant going to be? And then the contracts have got to be put in place. There are a number of items that have to be put in place for it to proceed properly, but that's roughly what it would mean, is potentially no impact to the taxpayer.
And let me just add there, James, the very latest grant program that has come out of the Ministry of Environment shows that they would potentially fund 2/3 of the project. And so Esquimalt then would be on the hook for the final third. And then, as Chris says, the revenues can keep that as a business opportunity for the community rather than a cost prospect.
But the
Thank you.
financial model hasn't assumed that. The financial model has assumed it's 100% debt financed.
It's all debt finance.
Yes. So I think you've answered the question of how would Esquimalt fund the initial outlay of $20 million. And another question here is, if the cruise ships ever come back, might the waste that they drop off be a feedstock?
It's an interesting one. Yes and no. Cruise ships are getting rather smart, and they're realizing that waste itself can be used to generate energy on board. So it depends on the cruise ship, how old it is and how they're working. They may already be putting it into essentially a mini incinerator, not what we would advocate, but anyway, they may be using it on board. If not, then yes, it would be possible to do so. However, that hasn't been assumed. We have really only looked at Esquimalt's wastes and not more.
And will there be any health risks to surrounding properties, including noise? I think that's been partially addressed, but further comments on that. Which one of you would take
Well,
that?
let me, because it is, I tried to address that earlier on. The operations, the noisy parts of the operation, which is the feedstock processing, is going to be all done indoors in a building that treats any air emissions from the building. So it's an odor control building. What was the other part? Noise, odors,
Emissions.
Pollution, emissions, yeah.
The emissions, yes, the plant will. When we test the feedstock, we will get to indicate whether it contains chlorides, whether it has sulfur, whether we're going to generate nitrates, and how much of those. And treatment systems will be put in place. And those treatment systems are known to reduce over 99.99% of contaminants.
Maybe I can be simple here.
Yeah.
The output from the oxidizer, as I understand it, is roughly equivalent to a natural gas boiler. If anything, slightly less. That's got to be proven, but it's really therefore very little different than having a natural gas boiler. And there's plenty of large apartments and D&D places around there with larger natural gas boilers than this will have. The stacks are required anyway to be high enough that it doesn't just fall out of the stack and then fall down on next door. And it's in the picture that I showed previously, you'll notice that there's two residences close by, but it's mostly D&D and so on nearby. The chances that this will have a negative impact are both under monitoring by the Ministry of the Environment and also low initially anyway.
Thank you. And what is the life of the plant before it has to be replaced?
With proper maintenance, the design right now and the funding and the cost of the plant is modeled over 30 years. It is made of high quality steel, stainless steel products. It will last for at least 50 years with continual maintenance. That plant could be around for 50 to even 60 years. So, yeah.
One of the factors in the consideration was the consideration of Esquimalt's change over time, and so the mechanism, particularly once we understood the variabilities of the organic feedstock, we switched the approach to having a number of smaller units, probably in the 5 to 7 ton per unit range. And the reason for it is the flexibility to swap these out and do rotational maintenance with no downtime. What that means is that Graham's talked about the physical obsolescence, but I'll talk about the economic obsolescence. Typically what happens is over a period of time, you get improvements in the technology or its operation. And so what this approach allows for is not only for the plant to be expanded as and when it's necessary and the township grows, but also for it to be swapped out and replaced by better technology that's more efficient, yields better value as and when that's needed. So although it's got a theoretical life cycle of probably 50 years, and we have included for full maintenance in the cash flows, but we've also provided a mechanism that's flexible to and adaptable for change in the future.
An addendum to that question is, will there be a number of units to handle the variation in load over the year? If so, will a number of small plants be used to bring online as required? I don't know if that's already been fully answered there.
So yes, I think probably the way that I can sort of best illustrate that is to switch back to Google Maps and show you. This is actually the gasifier at Dockside Green, which Graham was referring to, and it's going to be surrounded by residential development. So in terms of scale, you're really talking about something which is larger than that, but about that kind of size. And then bear with me while I zoom back over to Esquimalt. But what you'll see here is that the sorry if everybody's getting giddy right now, but I need to zoom in. So here is the site in the center of the screen. I hope you can see that. What you can probably just about see in this picture is a large truck. And so that large truck is about the footprint, slightly larger than that, but not by much, of one of the gasifiers. And so you can get an idea that if that's the size of the truck there, and this is the parcel of land that it would go onto, that what you would do is put, say, 5 of them in here. You'd start with 3, which is probably the optimal size, and then you can add a 4th or a 5th quite easily into this land. Now, this is not the only land that would be used. There's this land over here. You'd retain the parkland here, but you would put in the oxidizer and other components. Feedstock receipt and processing would take up the balance of the plant. And so what it means is that you can easily, with this flexible approach, deal with 24/7 operations, because the units themselves are really quite small. So that's why.
There's a question from Colin here that's not specific to the Esquimalt proposal, but about the technology in general. Would gasification be appropriate for use to process biomass from fuel reduction, that is forest and underbrush thinning, fire smart activities? What would be needed for a successful plant? And would it need to be mobile, as the feedstock would not be steady over time?
So the answer is yes, yes, yes. And as Chris has said, those smaller units up to 10 ton a day, you could have those, or even 12 ton a day, you could have those on skids or on wheels and have them mobile. And you could be taking that beetle kill, fire kill, brush component that is becoming a bit of a problem because of the fires, and definitely mobile gasifiers. Now, you're going to generate a lot of product, so electricity could be generated, but you still need a connection to the electrical grid to make use of that energy. The biochar obviously will be a hard product, and you could use that as in the carbon sequestration process and soil fertilizers. But to use heat and cooling, yeah, you're not likely to make use of that.
Yeah, we have looked at this for 2 applications in Eastern Canada. And so it's going through, it's been recommended, and it is going through consideration. We think it's also applicable for BC. The issue really is one of cost versus revenue. If you think about Esquimalt, we have the revenues from the tipping fees, but in a forest situation, you really have cost savings because you're avoiding a fire, but you don't have a tipping fee. So the energy side of it is also difficult to deploy. But what you might do is adjust the gasifier's operation to produce more biochar, because the biochar actually can be used as an energy substance. So you can now take the the mass, the biomass, which has essentially been distilled into a much more transportable product. And then you can move that to a location where you can better deploy it. What we have looked at in one instance is having what I would call small farming gasifiers to take the feedstock locally and then take it to a more central system, which is hooked into energy loops and other components, so we can maximize the revenues, but also maximize the resource recovery. And so there are a number of options here, and yes, it could be quite exciting.
So it looks like we've addressed all the questions that have come in live here. So thank you to everyone who's posted questions. It's been wonderful. And if you have any additional ones, please do pop them in now. And we want to, next steps question is, in terms of the feasibility, research, and so on, what is next? Chris?
Well, to me, it's risk management. Council, it's a complicated decision for any municipal authority. And so kudos to Esquimalt for taking it to this stage. The next steps really are dominantly to remove the major impediments and risk. And so those confirming with the Ministry of the Environment on permitting process, and they've asked us to delay it until there is an approval. And so that will be one of the steps that will be early. And the other ones will be to confirm on feedstock. That step has essentially already been started, just because it had already been asked a long time ago and it has come through. Some of the other components of risk management can be done early. And this is something that councils are not usually used to. You're essentially going through a contract risk de-risking process. And so the problem when you go through a general procurement system, it doesn't really work very well for this kind of approach. Whereas a managed de-risking is actually relatively simple, because you're talking to half a dozen or a dozen entities and you want their agreement. Well, that can be done through two stages: letter of intent and then contract. So it actually, a hands-on way of de-risking this is probably the simplest way of doing it. And that's part of the reason why we recommended the township consider actually implementing this itself. When the risks are better quantified, you're in a better position to go out and engage the private sector if that's desired, or to go out to tender, because you've quantified their risk, they'll give you a better bid. So there's a lot of reasons why the next stage really is de-risking.
Thank you. So we want to invite your feedback on this session. Has it been useful? Feedback about it, and we'll ask you to go ahead and put your comments in the chat box there to give feedback to us about this. And also anything further that you want to give feedback on beyond this, if you choose to, please do email Tara at her email is communications@esquimalt.ca. And I want to put a shout out here to Tara, who's done such a great job with the communications work on this, with getting it out in the news media, getting it out through the farmers market, and getting so many of all you wonderful people to show up and participate in this webinar. So kudos, Tara. And thanks also to you, Chris and Graham, for doing such a great job of handling a diverse and wonderful set of questions that we've received here. And just before we sign off, I want to say that we want all of you folks to go ahead and participate in this survey and spread the word about the survey that's online. We want to get feedback through that process as well. And if people haven't been able to participate in this webinar session, as noted, it will be posted. So encourage folks to have a look at the Esquimalt website. And you can have a look at this video there. And all of this material will be going forward to council. We'll be wrapping it up with a summary report from the survey, from this session, from all of this work. And council will be considering that and deciding on what will be the future of this initiative. So any final comments from you, Chris or Graham?
Oh, I'm delighted that Susan likes my curtains. They're designed to match my eyes. Yeah, the only comment that I would leave is that the council does need to know your wishes and thoughts. All infrastructure projects of this type have risks and complexities, but doing nothing isn't really a solution here. Because if you do nothing, the landfill will simply expand, and there are costs associated with that and missed opportunities. So you could think, okay, well, I can just do nothing. I don't know that that's necessarily a good alternative. So do encourage you to provide your comments to the township. They've been extremely good. Kudos also to Jeff on being very patient through this. So it's really a good community to do this in. It's about the right size, and I would encourage it.
There's a question here about how
And-
many people were participating in today's webinar, and I think the answer, maybe you haven't all been able to see the little participants button at the bottom of your screen as I have, but I believe there were 50 something registered, and at one point it was definitely in the 30s in addition to us as resource people. I don't know if anybody caught the what it peaked out at, but we trust that others will get to view it subsequently, and we're very pleased with this level of participation.
And
So
just
thank you again.
just before you close, James, I did note at one point there were 40 participants. So
Oh.
I did see the big 4-0 come up. And my, I just want to build on what Chris has said. It is very important that that you all reach out to the councillors and to the mayor and to staff and let them know of your thoughts, your support, your concerns around this. It is we're sitting on the top of a tsunami where this is an opportunity that we should not let pass us by. So we encourage you and we support you, and we'll be here to help you through all aspects of this project until it's fully developed and operational.
Thank you, Graham. So we will ask you to put any further feedback on the session, any questions additional, or any comments into that email that I mentioned, communications@esquimalt.ca, and Tara will forward that appropriately. And we're very much wanting to make sure things are addressed. If there's stuff that hasn't been covered here, you can keep your eye on that FAQ document, which is posted on the website there, and that will be updated to add any additional responses. So thank you again all around. Big gratitude. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for thinking about this and asking a great bunch of questions and the feedback that you've provided.
And thank you, James, for being such a good facilitator. Appreciate it.
Have a great night, everybody.